So we've got our player moving and animating correctly, but what about moving to the left? Now, what we really wouldn't want to do is have to create separate animations for when our player is facing to the left. So instead what we can do is actually just make the player flip horizontally so that they're facing the opposite direction depending on where we're moving. And how we can do that is by, if we go to the player here and look at the sprite renderer component, you can see down here we have a couple of options for flip X and Y. So I can flip X like that, and then suddenly our player is facing to the left. So we can flip back and forward, or I could do a vertical one like that, but that's not really a great looking style of thing for our game. So I'm going to say that we're going to use the flip X bool, so you can see it's a bool because it's either true or false, to determine which way our player is facing. So to do that, I'm going to stop this running here. We're obviously going to need to be able to access the sprite renderer in our player controller script. So let's jump into our player controller script. And up the top, we're going to add a private sprite renderer that we'll call the SR. And much like we did for the animator, in the start function, we're going to say the SR equals get component. And then this time inside the sharp brackets, we're going to say sprite renderer. Like so. Okay, so we've got our sprite renderer now found on our player. So the next thing we need to do is determine how do we know whether we should flip ourselves on the x-axis. So obviously we want to set the flip x to be true. If we go back in here to the player, just compile them for a second. There we go. We want it to be true when our player is facing to the left, and false when we're facing to the right. So with that in mind, how do we know if we're facing to the left? Well, if our velocity is below 0, so basically if we're moving to the left, then our sprite render should flip to being on the x-axis. So let's go down here, and after we do our jumping, we're going to say here, if the the rigid body dot velocity dot x is less than 0. So basically, hey, we're moving to the left. If we're moving to the left, then set the sprite renderer dot flip x. So flip x is that value that we want to change. The sprite renderer dot flip x equals, sorry, not false, equals true. So let's see that in action. I'm going to save this and we'll go back into Unity. Let it compile and we press play. When we move to the right, all works perfectly fine. When I move to the left, there we go, we switch over to facing the left. So that's perfect, but what about when we want to switch back to the right? Well, obviously we need to go back the other way. So there's two ways we could do this. One way that will cause an error and one way which is the correct way. So we'll show which way causes a bit of an error first. So what we could say is, hey, if the rigid body velocity is below 0, then flip the sprite. But if it's not below 0, so we could say else. So what we're saying here is, if this is true, do this. But if it's not true, then do the sprite renderer dot flip x equals false. So we'll save that. We'll go back in here. And once that's compiled, let's see what happens when we do this. I can move to the right perfectly fine, all the way over here, and I can move left and that looks fine. But when I stop moving left, the character actually automatically switches back to facing the right. So why is that happening? Well, if we go back to our script, we're telling it that the velocity.x is less than 0, then face left. But if it's not less than 0, so if it's above 0, but also if it's equal to 0, because remember, if it's not below 0, it could also be 0 exactly, which is what happens when we're not moving. So if we're not moving, then it flips it to being facing the other way. So instead, what we're going to do is add another if statement. So what we can do is, much like we did up here, is inside the bracket, add an if statement. But another easy way to do an if statement after an else statement like this is to say, if this thing is true, then else if, and we check something else. So we're here. So here we're saying if our velocity is below 0, do this. Otherwise, if our velocity rigidbody.velocity.x is above 0. So if it's above 0, then we're going to flip back to facing to the right. So then this way, when we stop moving, no matter which way we're facing, it won't try and flip around. It'll stay facing the direction that we last pressed, essentially. So let's save this, go back into Unity. Once that has compiled, we'll be able to play and see when I move to the right, perfect. When I move to the left, also perfect. So we stop moving and we're facing the correct way. And that's it. That's how we can make our player face in different directions as we move.